Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Jairo Lema. I am a teacher at the PUCESE. I am going to present my investigation entitled The Influence of the L1 Spanish on the L2 English Language Learning in a Rural School. This investigation took place in a rural school in Esmeraldas province due to the fact that I was an English teacher there. During my time teaching there, I noticed that most of the students have difficulties in the process of learning a new language. I also noticed that most of the students had problems with the structure and spelling of the first language. Some of these difficulties may be caused by linguistic interference. This affects every human being when trying to learn a new language. For this reason, the problem of the investigation emerged as how does the knowledge of L1 Spanish affect the L2 English language learning in 9th graders of Aurelia Becerra de Quiñones Rural School in Rio Verde, Esmeraldas Province 2020. To resolve the problem of the investigation, it was important to delimit the objectives that this investigation aimed to find out. The general objective was to analyze the influence of the L1 Spanish on the L2 English language learning, and the first specific objective were to identify gaps and errors in the students' first language learning in their L1 Spanish. The second was to identify the most frequent errors that the students make in the L2 English language learning, and the last specific objective to determine the influence that L1 Spanish knowledge has on the L2 English language learning. Moving on, it is necessary to define some terms that support this investigation. For the definition of mother tongue, Norquist and define it as the first language system that a human being acquire naturally. For foreign language, Moller and Catalano said that foreign language is learned in a community context where that language is not spoken. For the definition of rural school, the National Center for Education Statistics said that location is defined as rural according to the proximity of a location to an urbanized area. For the definition of language learning, Theron and Swavin mentioned that it is the production of the language when learners are trying to communicate using a foreign language. For interlanguage, Seliken said that it is a linguistic system that a student of a second or foreign language has to pass through in the process of learning a new language. And last, for the definition of linguistic interference, Dulay and Krashen mentioning that it is the transfer due to the habit of the surface structure of the first language onto the surface of the target language. In addition, there are many investigations that also gather data on the correlation between two languages with different results. Moving on, the methods of this investigation used were analysis, synthesis, and hermeneutics. This investigation followed a mixed approach, which means qualitative and quantitative with a descriptive scope. 3 different techniques were used to obtain information necessary. A guide of observation was used for the observation technique. It was formed by indicators to detect structural, lexical, and pronunciation errors. A list of errors was provided to identify the most common errors students make in English language learning. 2 questionnaires were used for the survey technique. One of them was in Spanish for the Spanish teachers to identify the most frequent errors students make in the L1 Spanish language learning. A second questionnaire was applied to English teachers to identify the correlation between errors in L1 Spanish and L2 English. Also, a questionnaire was used for the test technique to diagnose gaps in the students' language knowledge in the L1 Spanish language learning, and also to identify the most frequent errors that students make in the L2 English language learning. It consisted of 5 questions to diagnose gaps in the students' language knowledge of the L1 and to identify the most frequent errors that they make in the L2 language learning. Moving on to the results, looking at Table 1, 3 aspects of the language were measured among the teacher's input: structural errors, lexical errors, and pronunciation errors. The most common problem in structural errors were distinguishing grammatical tenses, subject-verb agreement, and placement of adjectives. The most common problem in lexical errors were inadequate vocabulary, cognates, collocation, and idioms. The most common problem pronunciation errors were mispronunciation of consonant at the end of the word, mispronunciation of vowels, stress in the growth syllable. With the observation technique, we can notice the same, almost the same problems in structural errors. One example was the problem in distinguishing grammar tenses. I played yesterday instead of played. She worked last night instead of worked. There is instead of was when mentioned the existing of something in the past. In lexical errors, one example was the problem in the inadequate vocabulary, lack of knowledge of common verbs according to their level, such as to be, to have, to do, to say, to make, to go, to know, and some others. Lack of knowledge of common adjectives according to their level, such as long, great, little, high, different, large, important, public, and others. In pronunciation errors, one example was the mispronunciation of phonemes. As we can see here, the TH sound, they didn't pronounce the TH correctly. Another example was the mispronunciation of consonants at the end of the word. Sleep, they didn't pronounce the P. Jump, the same, and tourist, the T. The result of the test showed that all the students had problems mainly in word order, word meaning, and writing. It was evident that there was a high influence of the writing skills in L1 on the writing skill in the L2, mainly because most of the students didn't write the paragraph request in neither English nor Spanish. Some of the results obtained in this investigation showed the relationship between grammar structure and language learning, and also shown an agreement with the investigation done by Yin in 1998. This investigation also reflects that there was a significant influence of knowledge of the first language with the foreign language learning. There were common errors in both languages that affect the development of the skills in English. However, these results were not in agreement with the investigation done by Train in 2010. Nevertheless, the investigation also showed an agreement with the research done by Saketsky in 2017. The results showed a strong significant correlation between L1 grammatical morpheme and L2 language proficiency. In conclusion, students had gaps and errors in first language knowledge. This could be identified through the observation of the classes and the survey applied to the teachers. Among these, their reading skills is the main problem that the students must overcome to prevent language interference. Being grammatical, lexical, and mispronunciation of words the focus point for teachers to be addressed in class. Also, I wanted to mention that it is necessary to investigate more specifically in rural areas where the lack of knowledge is more evident. The institutions and teachers must apply innovative strategies and techniques if they want to notice a change not only in the Spanish language but also in the learning of English as a foreign language. Thank you for your attention.